They say that home is where the heart is. But for me, home became the place where my heart was shattered. For 35 years. I worked as a librarian. I saved every single cent to pay off a mortgage of $450,000. I thought that house was my sanctuary, my legacy. When my son Brian asked to move in, I did not hesitate. I wanted to be a supportive mother. But Brian and his wife had a different plan. They did not want a family, they wanted a business. They waited until I was vulnerable, recovering from surgery. And they tricked me into signing away my deed. They threw me out into a tiny studio apartment, just so they could turn my bedroom into a neon-lit gaming suite. It was cold. It was calculated. Betrayal. That is the only word for it. Betrayal. I was down, but I was not out. Because they forgot one very important thing about the land that the house sits on. Before I tell you how I turned their neon dream into a silent nightmare, tell me, which state are you watching from today? Please leave a comment below. Also, please note, although this story is a dramatization written for your entertainment, the message it carries is very real. They say that a house is just made of wood, bricks, and mortar. But when you have spent your entire life working for it, a house becomes so much more. It becomes a testament to who you are. To me, my home was my independence. It was my trophy. It was my peace of mind. I spent 35 years working as a librarian at the county public library. 35 years. That is a long time to spend among the whispers of bookshelves and the smell of old paper. It was not a job that made me rich. No, not at all. But it was a job that gave me a purpose. I helped children find their first adventure stories. I helped seniors research their family trees. And every 2 weeks, when that modest paycheck arrived, I did something very important. I paid the bank. My mortgage was $450,000. To some people today, that might not seem like much. But to a single mother, working in a library, it was a mountain. A huge, steep mountain. I remember the sacrifices so clearly. I did not take fancy vacations to Europe or the Caribbean. No. I drove the same old sedan for 15 years, until the floorboards rusted through. I clipped coupons from the Sunday paper. I wore the same winter coat for a decade. Every extra penny, every single cent, went toward that house. I remember the day I made the very last payment. I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I looked at that final statement. 0. The balance was 0. I finally owned the dirt beneath my feet and the roof above my head. I was 60 years old, and for the first time in my life, I owed nothing to no one. It is a feeling of freedom that is hard to describe. It is a weight lifted off your chest. In our country, especially for my generation, owning your home is the ultimate dream. It means that no matter what happens in the world, no matter how high the prices go, you have a place where you belong. You have a sanctuary. I took such pride in that house. I polished the oak floors until they shone like glass. I planted rose bushes in the front yard that bloomed every June. I knew every creak in the floorboards. I knew exactly how the light hit the living room at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That house was my safety net. I thought that I would grow old there, reading my books and tending to my garden. I thought I had done everything right. I had worked hard. I had saved. And I had built a life of quiet dignity. I was a homeowner. I was independent. And I was proud. I never could have imagined, not in my wildest dreams, that the person I loved most in this world would look at my sanctuary and see nothing but an opportunity to take it away. There is a specific kind of silence that fills a house once your children grow up and move away. It is not a lonely silence, but it is a heavy one. For years, I lived in that quiet. I enjoyed my tea. I read my books, and I kept my home exactly the way I liked it. But then, one rainy Tuesday evening, The telephone rang. It was my son, Brian. I could hear the hesitation in his voice, a certain shakiness that I had not heard since he was a little boy who had scraped his knee on the playground. Brian told me that things were difficult. He and his wife, Tiffany, was struggling. The cost of rent in the city had climbed so high. It was eating away at their savings. He told me they had a dream of owning their own home. Just like I did. But they could not do it while paying $2,500 a month to a landlord who did not care about them. He asked me, with such a soft and humble tone, if they could come home for a while, just for a year or two, just until they could save enough for a down payment. My heart swelled. As a mother, your first instinct is always to protect. It is to provide. I did not see a man in his 30s on the other end of the line. I saw my son. I remembered the way he used to hold my hand when we crossed the street. I remembered the way he looked on his graduation day. I thought to myself, what is the point of having this big, beautiful, 4-bedroom house if it is empty? What is the point of all this space if I cannot use it to help my own flesh and blood? I told him, Brian, you do not even have to ask. This will always be your home. Bring Tiffany. Bring your things. We will make it work. I spent the next week preparing. I was so excited. I went to the grocery store and bought all the things he used to love. I bought the expensive coffee. I bought the blueberry muffins from the bakery down the street. I spent hours cleaning out the guest rooms. I bought the expensive coffee. I moved my crafting supplies into a smaller closet to make sure they had plenty of space for their clothes. I wanted them to feel welcome. I wanted them to feel safe. When they arrived, it felt like a new chapter was beginning. There was noise in the hallways again. There was the sound of the television in the evenings. Tiffany hugged me and told me I was a lifesaver. She told me that I was the most generous mother-in-law in the world. And I believed her. I really did. We had dinner together every night for the first month. We sat at the mahogany table that I had polished for 30 years. We talked about their future. Brian talked about his job in marketing. Tiffany talked about her dreams of becoming a digital creator. I felt so proud. I felt like I was doing something meaningful. In my mind, I was building a bridge for them. I was the foundation that would allow them to reach their goals. I did not charge them rent. I did not even ask them to pay for groceries. I told them to take every single dollar they earned and put it into a high-interest savings account. I wanted them to have that American dream. I wanted them to feel the pride of holding a key to their own front door. Looking back, I was so blind. I was blinded by my own love. I thought we were a team. I thought we were a family working toward a common goal. I saw the way Tiffany looked at the house, but I thought she was admiring it. I did not realize she was measuring it. I did not realize she was looking at my master bedroom and calculating how many cameras and lights she could fit inside. I was just a mother, happy to have her son home. I was happy to hear footsteps in the hall. I was happy. And in this world, sometimes happiness makes you forget to look for the shadows. The shift did not happen all at once. It was not like a light switch being flipped. No. It was more like the way the tide goes out. You do not notice it is happening until you realize the shore is suddenly dry and cold. After about 6 months, the atmosphere in my home began to sour. The dinners that were once filled with laughter became quiet and strained. I would try to ask about their day, but I would only receive one-word answers. Tiffany began to complain. It started with small things. She would say that the house was too dark. She would say that the old oak trees in the backyard blocked all the good light. Then, she started talking about the noise. She told me that the sound of me turning the pages of my books in the next room was distracting her. She told me that the hum of the old refrigerator made it impossible for her to concentrate on her work. She had started her streaming career. That is what she called it. She spent all day in the guest room, talking to a computer screen. She bought strange, colorful lights that turned the hallway purple and green at night. She started receiving boxes every single day. Boxes of microphones. boxes of high-tech chairs, boxes of cables and monitors. Our living room, which I had kept so tidy for decades, was now filled with cardboard and bubble wrap. One evening, as I was clearing the dishes, Tiffany sighed deeply. She looked at Brian and said that they were feeling very cramped. She said that a professional streamer needs a suite, not just a bedroom, but a suite. She said that my house had so much potential, but it was being wasted on old-fashioned things. She looked at my antique bookshelf, the one my father had built for me, and she called it an eyesore. She said it was taking up valuable real estate. Brian did not defend me. He just looked down at his plate. That was the most painful part. The silence of my son. He began to avoid my eyes. When I would walk into a room, they would stop talking. I could feel their frustration radiating off them like heat. They started treating me like a guest in my own home. If I left a teacup on the counter, Tiffany would huff and puff as she moved it. If I wanted to watch the evening news, they would tell me that they needed the high-speed internet for a live broadcast, and that I should go to my room. I started to feel small. I started to feel like a ghost in the house I had paid for with 35 years of my life. I would sit in my bedroom, the master suite, and I would listen to them whispering in the kitchen. I could not hear the words, but I could hear the tone. It was sharp. It was impatient. They were talking about me. I knew they were. Tiffany began to talk more and more about her business. She said that her followers were growing. She said that she was becoming a brand. And a brand, she said, needs a headquarters. She started dropping hints. She would say things like, "It is a shame this house has such a large master bedroom on the first floor. It would make the perfect gaming studio." She would say, "If we had that space, we could double our income in 6 months." I tried to ignore it. I told myself they were just stressed. I told myself that young people today have so much pressure on them. But the shadows were growing longer. The respect was gone. The gratitude that had been there at the beginning had turned into entitlement. They no longer felt like they were guests. They felt like they were the owners. And I was just an obstacle in their path. I was a librarian who liked silence and books, and they were streamers who wanted neon lights and noise. We were two different worlds, and I was the one who was being pushed out of my orbit. I did not know it yet, but the trap was already being set, and it was being set by the very person I had opened my door to save. The air in the dining room felt heavy, almost thick, like the humidity before a summer storm in Pennsylvania. I had prepared a pot roast. It was one of Brian's favorites. I thought that maybe, just maybe, a good home-cooked meal would soften the edges of the tension that had been growing between us. I wanted us to be a family again. I wanted to talk about the garden, or the book I was reading, or anything other than computer screens and neon lights. But Brian and Tiffany did not come to the table for a meal. They came for a confrontation. Tiffany sat down and did not even pick up her fork. She just stared at me. Brian looked at his plate, his shoulders hunched, his eyes avoiding mine. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Brian cleared his throat. He said, "Mom, we need to talk about the future of this house." I smiled, trying to stay positive. I said, "Well, I hope you have saved enough for your down payment. I am happy to help you look at some listings this weekend." But Tiffany laughed. It was a sharp, cold sound. She said, "Mom, we are not looking for a new house. We are staying here. But we have reached a limit. My streaming career is taking off. I have thousands of people watching me every night. And this little guest room, it is not enough anymore. It is unprofessional." I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked her, "What are you saying?" Brian finally looked up. His voice was flat, almost robotic. He said, "Mom, we need the master bedroom. We need the entire first-floor wing to turn into a high-tech gaming suite. It is the only way to scale the business. We have already looked at some floor plans. We are going to soundproof the walls, install a dedicated server line, and put in a professional lighting rig. I sat there, stunned. I thought he was joking. I said, Brian, that is my room. That is where your father and I slept for 30 years. That is my sanctuary. You are guests here. You are supposed to be saving money to leave, not taking over the house. But Brian did not flinch. He did not apologize. He looked me right in the eye and said, Mom, you have to be realistic. You are just one person. You do not need all that space. You would be much more comfortable in a small apartment. Maybe a nice assisted living studio downtown. They have activities there. They have people your own age. I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. I whispered, Are you asking me to leave my own home? The home I paid for? The home I worked 35 years to secure? Tiffany leaned forward. Her eyes were like flint. She said, It is not an ask. Mom, it is a necessity. This is a business move. Think of it like an investment. Your presence here, it is an inconvenience now. It is holding us back. You are a librarian. You understand logic. And the logic says that this space belongs to the people who are actually building something. A business move. Those words echoed in my mind. A business move. My son was treating his mother like a redundant employee. He was treating our family history like an old piece of furniture that needed to be hauled to the dump. I looked at Brian, searching for any sign of the boy I had raised. But I only saw a stranger. I saw a man who had traded his soul for a gaming suite and a few thousand strangers on the internet. My heart did not just break, it hardened. I realized then that the boy I loved was gone, replaced by someone who saw his mother as nothing more than an obstacle to his profit margins. I stood up from the table, my hands shaking. I told them, Enough. This is my house. My name is on the deed. I invited you in out of the kindness of my heart, but that kindness has ended. You have 2 weeks to pack your things and find a place of your own. I will not be bullied in my own home. I expected them to be angry. I expected Brian to argue or Tiffany to scream. But they didn't. They just sat there, perfectly calm. Tiffany reached into her designer purse and pulled out a manila envelope. She slid it across the mahogany table. The table I had polished every Sunday for decades. She said, Mom, you really should check your facts before you start making threats. Go ahead. Open it. Read the second page. My heart was pounding in my ears. A loud, rhythmic thumping. I opened the envelope. Inside was a document, a quitclaim deed. I scanned the words, but they didn't make sense at first. I saw the address of my home. I saw Brian's name. And then, at the bottom, I saw my signature, my own signature, bold and clear. I felt dizzy. I said, This is a fake. I never signed this. I would never sign this. I have never even seen this paper before. Brian finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which made it even more terrifying. He said, Mom, do you remember last year? When did you have your cataract surgery? I remembered. Of course. I remembered. Everything was a blur back then. My vision was cloudy, like looking through a sheet of wax paper. I was scared I was going to lose my sight forever. On the day of the surgery, when I was groggy from the medication and couldn't see a foot in front of my face, Brian had brought me some papers. He told me they were for the hospital. He told me it was a medical power of attorney so he could talk to the doctors for me if something went wrong. I trusted him. I loved him. I signed where he told me to sign. Tiffany smiled. A cold, predatory smile. She said, It wasn't a medical form. Mom, it was a gift deed. You legally transferred the entire property to Brian. As a gift, no money changed hands, which means there is no way to undo it easily. The house is his. We filed it with the county clerk months ago. You are not the owner. You are just a tenant at will. And, as the legal owners, we are giving you 14 days to vacate the premises. We have already called a locksmith to change the codes on the security system next Monday. I looked at Brian. I wanted him to say it was a mistake. I wanted him to say that Tiffany was lying. But he just looked away. He had stolen my home. My own son had waited until I was literally blind, lying in a hospital bed, to trick me into signing away my life's work. He didn't just want the master bedroom. He wanted it all. He had planned this. He had sat at my table, eaten my food, and hugged me goodnight, all while knowing that he had taken everything I owned. The world felt like it was tilting. I had to grab the back of the chair to keep from falling. I was 65 years old. I had no house. I had no son. I had nothing but a suitcase and a 14-day notice. They didn't see a mother. They saw an asset to be liquidated. They saw a room to be turned into a gaming suite. I walked out of that dining room, my legs feeling like lead. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just went to my room, the room that was no longer mine. And I sat in the dark. But in that darkness, a small spark began to glow. Brian and Tiffany were smart, but they were arrogant. They had studied the deed to the house, but they had forgotten to look at the map of the land. They had stolen the walls, but they didn't realize who still owned the ground beneath them. The first night in my new apartment was the quietest night of my life. But it was not a peaceful quiet. It was a hollow, ringing silence. I sat on the edge of a twin-sized bed in a room that was no larger than my old walk-in closet. The walls were painted a dull, institutional beige that looked like it had not been refreshed since the 1980s. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap floor wax. I had moved from a 4-bedroom house with oak floors and rose bushes to a studio apartment that cost me $1,500 a month. $1,500. That was nearly my entire monthly pension check. I had spent 35 years working, 35 years saving, only to end up in a place where the radiator clanked all night, and the window looked out onto a brick wall and a dumpster. I felt like a discarded object. I felt like a book that had been checked out, damaged, and then thrown into the trash pile behind the library. I spent the first week just sitting. I did not even unpack most of my boxes. I would stare at the stacks of cardboard and think about the things inside. My grandmother's quilts, my collection of first edition novels, my father's old surveying tools. They were all cramped in here with me, squeezed into a space that did not want us. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brian's face. I saw the cold, blank look in his eyes when he told me the locks were being changed. The betrayal was a physical weight in my chest. It felt like a stone that I had to carry every time I took a breath. I kept asking myself, where did I go wrong? Did I love him too much? Did I make things too easy for him? I remembered the nights I stayed up late helping him with his homework. I remembered the way I worked extra shifts during the holidays, just so he could have the newest sneakers or a better computer. I had given him everything, and in return, he had waited until I was blind from surgery to steal the only thing I had left. But as the days turned into weeks, the sadness began to change. It did not go away, but it started to sharpen. It turned into a quiet, cold clarity. I am a librarian. My entire life has been dedicated to the pursuit of information. I know how to research. I know how to look for the things that other people miss. I realized that crying was not going to pay my rent, and it was not going to get my dignity back. I began to establish a routine. I would walk to the local park. I would sit on a bench and watch the squirrels. I would think about my father. He was a man of the earth, a surveyor who knew every inch of this county. He used to tell me, "Mary, always look at the fine print. People will lie to you, but the land never lies. The land tells the truth every single time." I started to go to the public library in this part of town. I did not go to read novels. I went to the basement, where they kept the microfiche and the old county records. I needed to see something. I needed to remember the exact way my father had structured his estate. Brian and Tiffany thought they were so clever. They thought that a quitclaim deed was the end of the story. But they were looking at the house. They were looking at the walls and the gaming suite. They were not looking at what lay beneath. And in that tiny, lonely studio apartment, I started to formulate a plan. I was not just a victim anymore. I was a researcher, and I was about to find the one piece of information that would change everything. It was a rainy Tuesday when I found it. I had brought one specific box from my storage pile to the small kitchen table. It was a blue plastic folder that had belonged to my father. It had a layer of dust on it that felt like history itself. My father had passed away 20 years ago. But he was a man who planned for 100 years into the future. He was a surveyor by trade. He understood boundaries. He understood easements. And he understood that sometimes you have to protect people from their own mistakes. I opened the folder and began to spread the yellowed papers across the table. These were the original deeds from 1978. Back then, our property was not just one plot of land. It was a collection of smaller parcels that my father had stitched together over time. As I read the legal descriptions, my heart began to race. I felt a sudden, sharp jolt of electricity through my veins. I saw the deed that Brian had tricked me into signing. It was for the house, the structure, and it was for the 1 acre of land that the house sat upon. That was what the bank saw. That was what the lawyers saw. But my father had been very, very clever. He had deeded the house and that specific acre separately from the rest of the property. I pulled out a map. It was a hand-drawn survey, marked with my father's precise, elegant handwriting. I looked at the long, winding driveway that led from the main road to the house. According to the deed, that driveway, that private access road, was on a separate strip of land. A strip of land that was not part of the house acre. And who owned that strip? I checked the records. I checked them twice. I checked them 3 times. My name was there, my name alone. Brian had a deed for a house, but he did not have a deed for the only road that led to it. Then, I looked at the water. Our house was not on the city line. We relied on a deep, industrial-grade well. I looked at the survey map again. My father had placed the well house and the main water pump on a tiny, half-acre plot behind the garden. He had deeded that half-acre separately too. He called it a utility parcel. I looked at the quitclaim deed that Brian had forced me to sign. It mentioned the house and the primary lot. It did not mention the utility parcel. It did not mention the access road. I sat back in my chair. And I actually laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in months. It was a dry, hollow sound. But it felt wonderful. Brian and Tiffany had stolen a house, but they had stolen a house that was now, effectively, an island. They owned the building, but they did not own the way in. They owned the kitchen, but they did not own the water that flowed into the sink. In the eyes of the law, they were the owners of a structure. But I was the owner of the lifeblood of that structure. I owned the road. I owned the water. I owned the power lines that crossed over my private land to reach their roof. They had been so focused on the gaming suite, so focused on the neon lights and the high-tech computers, that they had forgotten to check the ground they were standing on. I realized that I did not need a lawyer to fight the deed. Not yet. I had something better. I had the power to simply close the door. I began to write a letter. Not a letter of anger, but a business letter. I'm a librarian, after all. I know how to be precise. I decided that I was going to lease my private road to a local construction company I knew. They needed a place to park their heavy equipment. And as for the well, I decided it was time for some very, very long-term maintenance. Brian wanted to move me out because I was an inconvenience. Well, he was about to learn the true meaning of that word. He was about to find out what happens when you steal a house, but forget to buy the land. I remember the morning I decided to take my life back. It was a Saturday. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the pavement of my tiny apartment complex. I sat at my small desk with a cup of black coffee. I had been planning this for weeks. I am a librarian, and librarians know that the best way to win a battle is through preparation, through research, through the cold, hard facts of the law. I had hired a local contractor. His name was Bill. He was an old friend of my father. Bill knew every inch of the county. When I showed him the survey maps, he just whistled low and shook his head. He told me, "Mary, your father was a genius. He built himself a fortress without ever raising a wall." Bill arrived at the property line at 7 o'clock in the morning. He brought 2 other men and a flatbed truck. On the back of that truck was a heavy, black, wrought iron gate. It was beautiful. It was strong. It was final. They worked quickly. They dug the post holes deep into the gravel and dirt of my private access road. They poured the concrete. They bolted the hinges. By 10 o'clock, the road that Brian and Tiffany used every single day was blocked. It was no longer a driveway. It was a dead end. I stood there and watched as Bill hung a sign on the gate. The sign was bright yellow. It said, "Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." But the gate was only the beginning. I walked down the narrow path that led to the utility parcel, the half-acre of land that sat behind the house. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning units from the main building. I could see the brand new, expensive, fiber-optic cables that they had run along the edge of the woods. They were so busy building their digital empire, their gaming suite, their virtual world. They had forgotten that they were still living in a physical one. I reached the well house. It was a small, cinder block building that my father had painted green 40 years ago. I opened the heavy wooden door. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp earth and oil. I looked at the master switch for the industrial-grade water pump. This pump was the heart of the house. It provided the water for the showers, the toilets, the kitchen, and the laundry. Without this pump, that $450,000 house was nothing more than a very expensive pile of wood and stone. I reached out my hand. I felt the cold metal of the switch. I thought about the way Brian had looked at me when he handed me that 14-day notice. I thought about the way Tiffany had laughed at my antique books. I felt a sense of calm, a sense of justice. I flipped the switch. The hum of the pump stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy. It was absolute. I locked the door to the well house with a heavy padlock. I was not being cruel. I was simply managing my property. I was a non-resident, and I had no legal obligation to provide utilities to a house I did not live in. I walked back to my car and drove to a small diner about a mile away. I sat by the window and waited. About noon, I saw a large blue truck turn onto the main road. It was an Amazon Prime delivery truck. I watched as it slowed down, approaching the turn for my old driveway. The driver stopped. He got out of the truck. He looked at the iron gate. He looked at the sign. He stood there for a few minutes, scratching his head. Then, he got back in the truck, put it in reverse, and drove away. About 30 minutes later, my phone began to buzz. It was Brian. I did not answer. I just watched the screen. He called again, and again, and again. I knew what was happening. Tiffany was probably in the middle of a live stream. She was probably telling her thousands of followers about her amazing new gaming suite, and then the water stopped. The toilets would not flush. The sinks were dry. No water for coffee. No water to wash her face. The house was an island. They were trapped. They could not leave the property without trespassing on my land. They could not receive deliveries. They could not even get a repairman to come to the door. They had stolen my house, but they had forgotten that a house needs a foundation. and I was the one who owned the ground. I took a sip of my tea and felt a peace that I had not felt in a very long time. The librarian had finished her research, and the lesson was just beginning. The following week was a whirlwind of chaos, but I watched it all from a distance. I am 65 years old, and I have learned that sometimes the best way to win is to simply step back and let the consequences of a person's actions catch up to them. Brian did not stop calling. He left voicemails that started with anger, then moved to confusion, and finally, to desperation. In one message, he was screaming. He told me, "Mom, you are crazy. You can't do this. We have a business to run. People are waiting for Tiffany's stream. We have sponsors. Do you know how much money we are losing every hour?" But in the next message, his voice was shaking. He said, "Mom, please, just turn the water on for a few hours. We can't even use the bathroom. Tiffany is crying. This is not fair." Fair. That word made me laugh. It was not fair to trick a mother during eye surgery. It was not fair to steal a 35-year legacy. I did not call him back. Instead, I had my lawyer send him a formal notice. The notice stated that the private road was now leased to a local construction firm for equipment storage. The notice also stated that the well was being decommissioned for a long-term environmental impact study. If they wanted to gain access, they would have to take me to court to fight for an easement. But a court case like that takes time. It takes months. Sometimes it takes years. And more importantly, it takes money. Money was something that Brian and Tiffany did not have. They had spent every single cent of their savings on that gaming suite. They had spent $40,000 on computers, neon lights, soundproofing, and high-speed internet lines. They had bought expensive chairs and designer clothes for Tiffany's camera. They were living a life of luxury on a foundation of sand. As the weeks went by, the virtual empire began to crumble. Without water, the house became a nightmare. You do not realize how much you depend on a simple faucet until it is dry. They had to carry jugs of water from a gas station just to drink. They had to use portable toilets. The smell, the heat, the inconvenience. It was too much for them. Tiffany's followers began to notice. She looked tired. She looked angry. She was no longer the glamorous streamer they wanted to see. The sponsors began to pull out. The income stopped. Then, the bank arrived. Brian had been so focused on the house that he had forgotten about the property taxes. He had forgotten about the insurance. Because the house was gifted to him, he was responsible for everything. But he had no money. The bank does not care about your streaming career. The bank does not care about neon lights. The bank cares about payments. When the payments stopped, the foreclosure process began. The most satisfying part, if I am being honest, was the day I heard that Tiffany had left. A neighbor told me that she saw a moving van parked out on the main road. Since the van could not get past my gate, Tiffany and Brian had to carry her designer suitcases and her expensive cameras, one by one, down the long driveway, past my iron gate, and onto the shoulder of the highway. Tiffany was shouting at him. She called him a loser. She said he had promised her a mansion, but he had given her a prison. She got into a taxi and never looked back. Brian was left alone in a house with no water, no wife, and no future. He had tried to play a game of strategy with a librarian, and he had lost. He had stolen the walls, but he had lost the home. He had wanted a gaming suite, and now he was sitting in the dark, surrounded by glowing lights and dead wires. His virtual world was gone, and the real world was finally knocking on his door. It was the sound of a sheriff's deputy, serving him the final foreclosure notice. The empire had fallen, and all that was left was the quiet, steady sound of the wind blowing through the trees on my land. My land, my father's land, the land that Brian had forgotten I owned. 1 year has passed since the day the bank took back the house that was built on my land. 1 entire year. It is remarkable how much life can change in 12 short months. Today, I am sitting on the porch of a beautiful, small cottage that I built on a quiet corner of my property. It is not a mansion. It is not 4 bedrooms, but it is mine. Every single nail, every single shingle on the roof. I paid for it using the money I earned from leasing my private access road to that construction firm. They paid me $60,000 for a 3-year lease. It was a good, solid business move. The air today is crisp. It smells of pine needles and the apple pie I have cooling on the kitchen counter. For the first time in a long time, I am at peace. I have my garden back. I have my silence back. And most importantly, I have my dignity back. I spent my morning in my favorite part of the new house. I call it my reading nook. It is a small, sunlit corner with a built-in bookshelf and a very comfortable leather chair. There are no neon lights there. There are no computer screens. Just the quiet rustle of paper and the warmth of the sun through the glass. I was just about to go inside when I heard the sound of an engine. It was not the smooth, quiet hum of a new car. It was the rattling, coughing sound of a vehicle that was on its last legs. A beat-up, rusted truck pulled into the small gravel area near my gate. I stood up slowly, my heart beginning to throb in my chest. I knew that truck. I knew the man behind the wheel. Brian stepped out of the truck. He looked terrible. He looked like a man who had been fighting a war and had lost every single battle. He was thin, far too thin. His clothes were wrinkled and stained. The arrogance that he used to wear like a shield was completely gone. He walked toward my porch, his head hanging low. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at me. His eyes were red, and I could see the shine of tears. He whispered, "Mom." I just stood there. I did not move. I did not speak. I waited. Finally, he found his voice. He told me that Tiffany was gone. She had left him the very day the movers took her cameras. She told him he was a failure. She told him she did not love him. She only loved the life he had promised her. He told me he had lost his job because he could not focus. He told me he had spent every penny he had on lawyers, trying to fight the foreclosure. But he lost. He lost everything. He looked at my beautiful, new cottage, and he swallowed hard. He told me he was living in a shack, a small wooden shack behind a warehouse in the city. It had no heating. It had a leaky roof, he said. "Mom, please. I am your son. I have nowhere else to go. I made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. Can I just come home? Can I just stay in the spare room for a little while until I get back on my feet?" I looked at him. This was the man who had waited until I was blind from surgery to steal my home. This was the man who had given me a 14-day notice to leave the house I had worked 35 years to pay for. This was the man who told me that my presence was an inconvenience. I felt a flicker of the old pain, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, clear resolve. I said, "Brian, do you remember what you told me at the dining room table last year? You told me that removing me was a business move. You told me that I would be more comfortable somewhere else." I looked at my house and then back at him. I said, "I have turned my only spare room into a reading nook. It is for my books. It is for my peace. It is a lifestyle move, Brian. And I think you will find that your shack is much more suited to your current status. You wanted a gaming suite, and you ended up with a shack. That is the reality of the choices you made." He started to cry. He sobbed. "Mom, please. I am your flesh and blood." I looked at him with a steady gaze. I told him, "Brian, respect is the foundation of any home. If you destroy that foundation, you do not deserve the roof above your head. You did not just take a house. You tried to take my life. I have forgiven you in my heart, but I will never allow you back into my sanctuary." You are a stranger to me now. I turned around and walked toward my front door. I did not look back. I could hear the sound of his truck starting up, the engine sputtering as he drove away. I walked into my kitchen and felt the warmth of the sun on my face. I realized that justice is not always about winning in a courtroom. Sometimes, justice is simply about standing your ground. It is about knowing your worth. I sat down in my reading nook and picked up a book. It was an old story about a person who found their way home after a long journey. I realized that I was that person. I had found my way back to myself. Brian wanted to turn my life into a game, but he forgot that in the real world, there are no reset buttons. He got his gaming suite, and he got a front row seat to the consequences of his own greed. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the apple pie. I was home. And this time, no one was ever going to take it away from me. I am sitting here now, in my small, quiet garden. The sun is beginning to set over the hills of Pennsylvania, casting a soft, golden glow over the roses I planted last spring. The air is cool, and for the first time in many years, the world feels right again. I have my tea, I have my books, and I have my peace. My son, Brian, he made his choice. He thought that a gaming suite and a virtual career were more important than his own mother. He thought that greed was simply a business move, but he learned a very hard lesson. Greed is a lonely path. It is a hollow victory. When you destroy the trust of the people who love you, you end up with nothing but an empty shack and a heavy heart. He wanted to turn my sanctuary into a place for strangers to watch him play games. Now, he is the one on the outside looking in. To all of you watching today, especially my fellow seniors, your independence is your greatest treasure. You worked 35 years for it. You worked 40 years for it. You earned every single brick of your home. You earned every moment of your retirement. Never let anyone, even your own flesh and blood, take that dignity away from you. Respect is the foundation of every home. Without it, the roof will eventually fall. If you do not have respect, you do not have a family. I want to thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. Please remember, although this story was created to be engaging and easy to understand, the message it teaches is very real. It is a lesson about integrity and the consequences of our actions. The details may be fictional, but the value of the message is true. It is a story about standing your ground when the world tries to push you down. If you believe that what goes around comes around, please like this video. It helps our small community of storytellers grow. And if you have a story of your own, or if you have a word of wisdom for the younger generation, please share it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I cherish your words. Thank you for watching Elderly Stories. Your support means the world to me. I hope you find peace in your own homes today. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. God bless, and I will see you in the next story.